Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lesson from the animal behavior course. Today, we're going to be talking specifically about sensory mechanisms. So, it'll be a very quick presentation just to kind of highlight how behavior can arise through sensory input. So essentially, there are specialized sensory systems that are designed to detect certain environmental stimuli and then trigger a response in the animal. So an animal's nervous system is specifically designed to detect stimuli that are relevant or important to the animals, right? So if a stimuli is not important to the animal, then their sensory systems won't be designed to either pay attention or detect it. Now, basically, the idea of sensory mechanisms is that, remember, we're trying to explain why a behavior is occurring. And so essentially, a sensory mechanism is just saying that some behavior are triggered by certain stimuli. So to highlight how sensory mechanisms play a role in animal behavior, I'm going to go over a really interesting experiment having to do with toad and vision and how they detect certain sort of shapes in their environment. I know that the 3D model on your screen is a frog, not a toad, but it's the only 3D model that PowerPoint has access to, so you're just going to have to bear with me. So essentially, what they did for this experiment was they put a toad on a pedestal and then they moved shapes around the toad in a circle. And then they measured how frequently the toad would orient itself towards that shape. And so you watch as the object kind of moves around the center plate. And then, like I said, they measured how much the toad would orient towards the object. And so they were interested in what objects that toad was detecting. They started out with a vertical rectangle as the first shape. So they went ahead and put that vertical rectangle on the sliding track and let it go around the toad a couple times. They then measured how often the toad oriented towards that rectangle and found that the toad did not orient very frequently, if at all. And so it's a very rare occurrence for the toad to kind of turn to that vertical rectangle. The next object that they did was a square. So the square elicited a more frequent response than the vertical rectangle, but it was still not a lot of orientation towards the square. And so finally, for their final shape, they did a horizontal rectangle. And sure enough, they found that the horizontal rectangle was oriented to a lot. So the toad would turn very frequently to look at that horizontal rectangle. And so the question is, what in the world is going on here? To understand what's going on, we need to take a closer look into the eye of the frog. So if we look at the retina of the frog, there are two types of cells that make up the retina. There are excitatory cells and inhibitory cells. And essentially, there's one rule that needs to go into effect. The rule is that more excitatory cells have to be activated in order for the frog or for the toad to turn their head to look at the object. And so if you see here, this is what happens when you get a vertical rectangle coming across the field of vision. You'll notice that there are more inhibitory cells activated than there are excitatory cells. In which case, this is why the frog does not turn to look at vertical rectangles. In contrast, if you have a horizontal rectangle pass in front of the visual field, you will see that based on the arrangement of the excitatory cells, that there are more excitatory cells activated than there are inhibitory cells. And so this does cause the frogs to turn their head. And so I beg the question, why would their sensory systems be adapted to behave in this kind of way? Take a second to think about that. Why would they have a design where their sensory input reacts to horizontal but not vertical stimuli? Well, it's rooted in their biology and their foraging, right? Toads are on the ground, which means they eat a lot of bugs that go crawling around. And last time I checked, worms do not have legs and they do not stand up vertically, right? Instead, worms or other insects are often lying flat on the ground or crawling on the ground, which makes a horizontal stimuli much more effective at at much more effective for feeding the organism, right? And so they have this design in their sensory system to respond and turn their head towards horizontal objects because it makes the most sense for them. And so to wrap up, sensory mechanisms are all about how animals detect and respond to their world. Each species has evolved specialized filters that emphasize cues relevant to their survival and their reproduction while ignoring irrelevant information like vertical stimuli in toads, right? Worms don't stand straight up, so in order for them to eat, they need to be able to detect horizontal stimuli. And so another example of this is in bats and in moths. So bats use ultrasonic echolocation to sort of pinpoint flying insects in the dark, and they can even adjust the frequency of their calls to get more detailed information as they close in on their prey. But on the flip side, moths have also evolved ears that can specifically locate bat calls, right? We can't necessarily hear bats, but moths can, right? Allowing them to hear ultrasounds and do this sort of diving behavior where when they hear ultrasound, they'll like stop flying and plummet out of the air, right? So that's another sensory mechanism. And so the big takeaway here is that sensory systems don't passively record the environment like a camera. They're actively shaping behavior, highlighting that certain signals matter more than others, and then causing the animal to sort of pay attention and then respond to those more important relevant signals first.